Hey, everybody, and welcome to our panel discussion and webinar today, How to Prepare for Your Next Cyber Incident. I think that we were discussing how important this topic is. Um, obviously, as we were putting this together, and then one of the stories that Mike Hamilton and I were just talking about was, and I don't know if any of you are in Southern California, but the LA Unified School District had a ransomware attack, and as more information comes out about that as they make filings, it becomes even more important that folks prepare for their next cyber attack. I think we are sadly long beyond the time period at which anyone believes that an organization is immune or that there's a silver bullet or anything like that that can stop a cyber attack. So that's my way of smiling and saying, well, good morning to those of you on the West Coast, and good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. So, a couple of things before we get started. If you haven't been to our events before, welcome. We'll introduce ourselves in a second. A couple of housekeeping things. If you registered for this, the system will send you a recording of this. So if you have to drop out or you missed something or the recording or anything, let us know. If you don't get a recording, because it is a system and it does sometimes, go to spam or go to junk or something, you can always email me, jake@criticalinsight.com, and let me know, and I'll make sure you get a link to it. Also, there's a chat, and you can see people saying hi and where they're joining from in the chat. Two things. One, jump in. Let us know where you're joining from. So far this year, we've had one person join from Australia, and that's been the furthest afield. But we love having folks join from wherever they're joining from. And at the top of the chat, there's a little bell. If the chat is going bloop, 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 and it's really annoying you, hit that bell and it'll mute the chat. The chat is actually a really important place because it's where you can ask questions. I love interrupting the presenters and asking the questions, or we'll type an answer to you in the chat there. So please go ahead and use the chat as we go. My name is Jake Milstein, and I host the events and run marketing for Critical Insight. We are surprisingly a cybersecurity company. No, we're a cybersecurity company. We provide what we call cybersecurity as a service, which means we help organizations prepare for an attack, detect an attack quickly through our security operations centers, and respond rapidly. And obviously, today we're going to be talking a lot about preparation. John Luke Peck is going to be doing a bulk of the presenting today. He's our director of incident response. Fred Langston is Fred Langston and Mike Hamilton are both founders of the company. Fred is our chief product officer, and Mike is our CISO. And there's my picture on the right when I had a shorter beard. So what we're going to cover today is these 5 topics. We're going to cover IR plans. We're going to cover tabletop exercises. We're going to cover cybersecurity insurance. We're going to cover monitoring and alerting and how that fits into all of this. And we're going to cover incident response retainers. And with that, John Luke, when you and I started talking about this, you help organizations, with their IR plans. And you said, folks who start to work with you realize sometimes how unprepared they are. What are the things that they can do to be more prepared?
So the first and foremost things that we can talk about are right up here on the list. That's why we made it one of the first slides here, is because if this is all that you take away from this webinar today, these 4 things are what I should take a look at and focus on here. That's the key message that we want to communicate, and I'm going to say mission accomplished there, but I do hope you stick around for the rest of the webinar here. As we're working with clients, both in terms of incident response preparedness, an organization who says, we don't know what we don't know where we are at the moment, we just want to get a feel for how we're ready right now, what do we need to do to get even more ready? These are the things that we see most organizations are missing. First up is a current incident response plan. We're either seeing organizations don't have one at all, or they have one that's very old. Things like last refreshed in 2014. Not out of the realm of possibility for what we run into quite frequently when we're working with companies to develop their IR plans or review them ahead of a tabletop exercise, for example. If you have an IR plan, but it's way out of date, if it's referring back to infrastructure that you don't have anymore or people who aren't within the organization anymore, I'd argue if you have a document that's actually usable. When your folks encounter an incident, when something starts to be urgent enough that needs to be referencing the IR plan or thinking about activating an incident, you want that document on hand, but you want it to be useful and relevant. You don't want to be having to sift through and figure out, okay, do we actually have that building anymore? No, that network got thrown out years ago. Ooh, I don't think he's here anymore. So you want to have it an up-to-date document. You want to make sure that it's referencing current infrastructure, things like Office 365, AWS, where your data actually lives. That's first and foremost then. Number two is having pre-staged resources. So cybersecurity insurance, but also incident response retainers and service providers. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little later on here, but having both is part of a really good reserve package, having in your quiver to be able to pull out on short notice if and when an incident starts to become bigger than what you and your team are able to handle in the course of the moment. Third up is practicing tabletop exercise events. So these are a chance to go through and practice using your incident response plan. Even if you don't use the IR plan, believe me, we conduct more than a few tabletop exercises where the IR plans never actually get opened. You want to make sure that the team have practice events where they can come together and talk about, if I had an incident, here's what I would do. Or if I saw these types of symptoms first thing on a Monday morning, here's what I would start working on. And then work to help identify where are the points where somebody would decide, yes, this qualifies as an incident. I'm putting my hand up and declaring an incident right now. We need to activate these things. And then walk through with both the technical teams and your executive teams what that's going to look like as far as response efforts. We'll talk a little bit more about that coming up here as well. And then number four is monitoring and alerting. You're not likely to know that there's an incident going if you don't have systems which are watching for suspicious activity or malicious behavior. If your reporting channels are simply employees who put their hands up and say things like, I saw an email that I'm a little concerned about, or my computer started driving itself first thing this morning, that's certainly one way of being notified of an incident. But one of the things that we look at is how do we get advance notice of behaviors which may become an incident? How do we identify risky and malicious and suspicious activities so that IT teams and information security teams and response staff can put eyes on those kinds of activities very quickly and hopefully cut them off before they become things like a full-blown ransomware incident?
Yeah, and we mentioned that LAUSD thing earlier, LA Unified School District thing earlier. Apparently the bad guys were in there for a month before the ransomware hit. So we'll have to find out what their alerting was like if that comes out. Okay, so now we're going to dive deep into each one of those, starting with IR plans. So Luke.
So again, a lot of orgs don't have one at all, or if they do, it's old and outdated. Now, if you don't have an IR plan, what this means is that by default, you are going to choose to freestyle an incident. What we mean by that is you're not going to be working against a coherent plan. Your staff are going to be making up response actions as they go along. You're going to have to be making decisions on the fly as to whether this makes sense or this does not make sense. But on top of that, your response staff are going to have to be thinking about everything having to do with an incident. This is not just, do my IT teams know how to upload a file hash to block it with our EDR tool? This is not just, do we know how to negotiate with ransomware attackers? This is also, at what point do we need to notify customers? At what point do we need to get our cybersecurity insurance activated? At what point do we need to start thinking about whether we need to unplug the internet or shut down the business so that we can continue to respond without the incident spreading and expanding? You absolutely can make those decisions on the fly. A lot of organizations do so, and I would say navigate their way through an incident fairly successfully, but it's chaotic. It's challenging. There's a lot happening at any given time, and people oftentimes will miss something. You'll miss thinking about, well, should I have contacted legal here? Should I have notified my insurance company within 72 hours? These systems appear to be at risk. Do we need to consider expanding the scope to include these here? And so making sure that you've got these things documented doesn't have to be like every scenario and every example, but for example, having a playbook for ransomware activity, playbooks for business email compromise, playbook for compromised user accounts. Those are what we would call scenario or situation specific documentation. Having an overall incident response plan that helps establish the management and the governance structure for how do you manage and maintain an incident, who's making the decisions, who's doing the groundwork, working with the technical tools and pulling information, but then feeding it up to the people who will be deciding, yes, we're going to pay the ransom, or no, absolutely not, we will never pay the ransom, or here's the public statement that we're going to be putting out. We want to make sure that all those things are managed and decided on ahead of time so that you're not having to come up with those decisions on the fly during a high pressure situation.
And and John Luke, just as a definition here, IR, BCDR. IR is incident response. BCDR.
BC and DR is business continuity and disaster recovery. Now, these are kind of three facets of the same rock here. So, incident response is a tool or a plan which is used specifically when you have a cybersecurity event or something which becomes an incident where you're activating your incident response team. Business continuity plans, those focus very specifically on how do we keep business operations rolling even when email goes down and offline, even when the ERP system is down and offline. Then disaster recovery plans are typically focused on how do we restore services. So if business continuity plans say, well, everybody just fails over to using their cell phones and paper and pencil accounting methods just while we're during this incident type of stage here, disaster recovery is how do we get our ERP systems back online? How do we get finance and accounting signed back into their systems, for example?
Yeah, and and one of the stories that came up last year, and Fred and I have talked about it at some length, is I was talking to an organization, and I said to them, "Oh," they said, "Oh yeah, we have a great IR plan." I said, "Oh, that's great. Read me the first two paragraphs," and they got to I think the second sentence, third sentence, and it said, "Call John." They're like, "Who's John?" John hadn't worked there for several years. And Fred, you've seen all sorts of old IR plans, right?
Well, and we've also seen people doing a poor job on maintaining the whole suite of these things because incident response usually rolls into disaster recovery. If you have ransomware, you're probably activating your disaster recovery plan to bring your systems back online. So if these are not all kept up, you're leaving a critical component off. They really have to work kind of together.
Yeah, and I'll say that it is a requirement for everybody who's regulated, but just as a standard of practice, that every year you go through all your policies and see what kind of revisions you need to make in your IR plan. And in our case, we have an IR management policy and then playbooks
Hmm.
that needs, get some eyes on that every year just to make sure that that's updated, especially like you're pointing out, contact information. If there's contact information in there, it's got to be accurate.
Yep. Yep. All right. So JLP, why have an IR plan?
Well, so again, this is mainly so that you don't need to come up with these kinds of decisions on the fly while you're looking at systems getting attacked, while you're trying to figure out how many user accounts are in question here. Have we accidentally been sending emails to our partners with malicious attachments? And how many systems has the ransomware? These are the moments when you don't want to be thinking, who should I notify? What's their phone number? At what point do I escalate this up to my executive team? Or when should we activate insurance? Oh no, I haven't looked at insurance since we got the contract. I got to go find the contract documentation and the policy information and everything now. Having an IR plan puts all of those questions in a single document that you theoretically have on hand that you can pull up very quickly when an incident starts to happen. Doesn't mean you have to activate an incident. Doesn't mean that you have to notify your insurance carrier or prepare a press statement. It just means that if you get to the point where those things do need to happen, you've got an established structure for how to go about conducting that, how to activate the teams, how to make sure that decisions are flowing up to the right places where they need to, and you don't have an employee who answers the phone and it turns out to be the New York Times saying, "Hey, we saw rumors that you're having a security incident. Do you have any comment there?" IR plans are what help say or help advise to your employees, hey, calls like that need to get flowed up to the executive team so that the corporate communications department can respond accordingly here. So on top of that, the contact information for when to call these outside parties. cybersecurity insurance, your outside legal counsel, partner or parent companies who may want to either be involved with or informed about how an incident is progressing so they can determine whether they need to take any response actions as well. Again, putting all this information into a single repository so that you've got very quick access to it and it's all current and up to date.
Yeah, and I'll say, as somebody who came from, being in the media, I ran TV stations. Um, one of the things that organizations need to do, and John Luke put it on the PR and media here, is when you build an incident response plan and you start thinking about those communications. If you have an external PR firm, or you don't have a PR firm, or you have internal people, it's one of those times where you say, oh, that needs to be something they know how to do, because it may be something they know how to do and something they don't.
Hey, Jake,
Yeah.
I wanted to mention real quick about they had executive participation
Oh,
in
yeah.
your IR plan, and people commonly miss the fact that you need the executives. And in particular, for example, if you're a hospital, you need the chief medical officer. If you're a school, you need whoever is running the operation of the school in those meetings, because you may need to transfer patients. You may need to be able to shut down operations. What do you do in those instances? So those people are as much involved in this as the technology folks. A lot of times people miss that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
legal has to be at the table too. Legal must be at the table.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, John Luke.
So, following up from this webinar, as soon as we walk away here, our hope is that you're going to go and you're going to take a look to see, where is my IR plan? Do we as a company have one? How recent is it? Is it still relevant? If I needed to activate this document tomorrow, is it going to be any use? If the answer to any of those questions is no, then you've got a couple of options. One is you can try and perform the updates and get information, gathered together and get the document circulated around for review and approval internally. A lot of organizations do that themselves and they're very successful at it. Sometimes they'll give us a call and they'll say, hey, we've got a document. We think we feel pretty good about it. We'd just like another pair of eyes. Can you review it and send us any changes or recommendations we should apply? We're happy to do that. A lot of organizations also say, we don't know where to start. We're not sure if we should use a template. Should we go buy something? Should we write it ourselves? How should we go about this here? And so they can hire it out. Our team, the incident response team at CI, when we're not working on incidents, we will help you prepare for an incident by conducting a tabletop exercise and by writing IR plans. So we have documentation that we can pull together for you. We can write documentation specific to your environment or your technologies, but we make sure that your IR plans are going to be a usable document, something that you can refer to very quickly, and which has got all the necessary information, not just contact info for your insurance company and partner companies and who on your executive team do you need to notify, but it also includes the management structure, the governance structure for how do you manage an incident, who's making decisions, who's authorized to call law enforcement, who's authorized to talk with the press, who's authorized to manage the spending here. All of those things are addressed and accounted for in our documentation, and we're more than happy to customize it. So for organizations where, again, you're not sure where to start, you're not sure exactly what you need, you can always hire it out, and we're more than happy to help.
Yeah, and if you looked in the chat, April put in a template for K-12. It's a great thing to look at. Regardless of whether you're in K-12 or anywhere else, those CISA templates are a great place to start and see if it's something you can do on your own or if you need help. John Luke, you mentioned tabletops. One of the things, and I think you actually stole this from Fred, but they don't do much good if nobody knows what to do with them, and you don't want to be reading the fire extinguisher manual during a fire, which is, I think Fred says that so much he must have it as a bumper sticker on his car. But Fred, for the first time, I actually did hear, put the instruction manual for you for a fire extinguisher.
Thank you.
But I do want to dig deeper into tabletop exercises, John Luke. What do people get wrong?
So these are the main things that we see organizations struggling with. If you're thinking about tabletop exercise as being a once a year type of event, or it's a thing that we do for compliance, we're checking the box to make sure we do that thing for insurance or whatever, you're not getting nearly as much out of a tabletop as you could be. We've also seen organizations where they'll gather the IT team together and they'll walk through a type of technical incident, or they'll gather the executive team together and they'll walk through a type of incident, but those teams often are working separately. what we see with organizations doing tabletops is the best ways to go about it are a multi-pronged approach. And I think we've got another slide about that. So I'm going to wait on that here for just a second. But the third point is actually opening and using the IR plans. I've lost count of the number of tabletop exercises we've conducted where even when we say ahead of time, don't forget to bring a copy of your IR plans. And then during the session, as we're getting acquainted, we say, and hands up those of you who have got your IR plans in hand. A lot of people will put their hands up in the room. But then as we're walking through scenarios in the heat of the moment, they're working on decision making. They're trying to process what's going on. What do we need to be thinking about? What do we need to be factoring in our next steps here? They don't go so far as to open the IR plans. At the end of the session, when we say, okay, hands up those of you who actually referenced the IR plans, it's typically single digit percentages compared to where we were when we asked who's got a copy of it. So again, this comes back to, is the IR plan useful and relevant to you? Because if it's a 10-year-old document, it doesn't matter if you open it up, if it's no use. But if you do have a current document, if you know it's applicable and it's up to date and it's a good document you want to be working from, the next step is to actually make sure you use it.
And Fred and Mike, I know you've been, you've been involved in this for years. What mistakes have you seen people make in tabletops?
Well, go ahead, Fred.
No, go ahead.
So not exercising the right kind of event is kind of typical, right? Because when people think incident, it's okay, somebody's workstation got hacked. Okay, that's not the incident. The incident is something that's going to affect that could result in fines, customer flight, regulatory scrutiny, a consent decree from the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Federal Trade Commission, things like that. That's the kind of thing you really need to have everybody around at the table. And so when they pick a scenario for an exercise, make sure it's the kind that you really are going to need to really bring this group together. That's why we have an incident management policy, which says if somebody calls an incident, and we've defined the transition between an IT incident and a security incident. When that happens, somebody pulls the trigger, anybody's allowed to do that, and a certain group of executives, the same group, will always come around the table. They will say, who else do we need to be here? Who are we going to designate as the response team? And what is the reporting cadence that we expect from that response team coming back to us? Because that management group has the responsibility to speak publicly, to buy things if we need to limit our liability. That's why legal has to be at the table. So really, there are two parts to it. And I think a lot of people just say, we got cybered and we lost, access to some servers or something like that. That's not it. That is not the kind of incident we're talking about. This is the kind that could be, potentially existential for a business. That's the one you got to practice.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So the thing I see commonly is the tabletop exercise scenario should be exercising almost every person on the IR team in the same steps. A lot of people do this sequentially, where it starts out in IT and eventually at the end it gets to the executives. That's not how this should be operating. Everybody should be reacting in real time together, and everybody has to be making decisions. In particular, as a scenario unfolds, usually you get more and more services are being dropped or owned by the bad guys. There's a point where you have to make pure business decisions. People need to make those business decisions ahead of time. The number one business decisions: are we going to pay a ransom, and what is the limit? I mean, you should have decided that long before you ever step into a real incident, and a tabletop is a great place to learn.
Your insurance company will decide that for you.
Quite possibly.
Yeah. All right, John Luke, takes a lot of effort. It's worth it.
It absolutely is. Over the last couple of years, tabletop exercises have popped off as being a service which a lot of organizations are seeing the value of, and they want to do an exercise. We've got a lot of organizations as well that are conducting multiple exercises per year, which I am a huge fan of, and I'm going to explain why here in just a moment. But one of the things that we talk about is making sure, just to Fred's point, you've got the right people at the table and that you've got the executive and technical teams working in concert together. And so there are several types of TTEs that we recommend. And we talk with an organization that says, I want to do a TTE because we want to understand, what are you looking to get out of it? Do you want your IT team to have a practice event where they can talk through the types of tools they use and the types of containment activities they may need to take? That's perfectly valid. That's an entire program in and of itself. And there's others where the executive team need to be focusing on business management decisions, like if we lose the patient scheduling system or if we lose the finance and accounting system, are we able to keep the lights on? Can business keep operating for now? And if so, how? Or do we just need to hit the pause button on everything until we can get this sorted out and get the incident cleaned up here? Those are decisions which, to your point, Mike and Fred, should be happening at the business management level, not being made by IT directors and information security managers. But they both have to work together. They both work in concert together, because the executives won't be making decisions unless IT has said, hey, by the way, a thing's happening, here's how it affects us, and here's what our capabilities are right now. That's when the business leadership team has to decide, here's what we've got going, here's the impact to us, here's what we need to do next. But they've got to have the information on hand, and they've got to still be directing the technology teams. Yes, unplug the network. Yes, start shutting down servers, or check our backup, see how recent we've got a successful backup from.
And
All of these. Yeah, go ahead.
And I was going to say, and I guarantee, and I will tell you, if you do a tabletop exercise and it's the first time you did one, and your legal team and your PR team are on the same page, I'll buy you a coffee.
Yeah, I was going to say that people don't realize the level of communications that needs to go on throughout an incident. And it's to multiple groups that all need different messages. The people may be affected by the breach, internal or external. Then potentially you need to speak to your organization as a whole. You need to speak to regulators. You need to speak to your partners and vendors. You need to speak to your customers. You need to speak to the press. All of these are key components that need to be managed.
Yep, absolutely. All right. How do you do it right, Jean-Luc?
Well, I know this is going to be a big bite for a lot of people who are looking at this going, 4 tabletops a year? Are you serious? I can barely get everybody together for 1 a year. How am I supposed to make 4 happen? Well, we're going to tell you how. So first up, we recommend 1 tabletop exercise per quarter. Why? Well, if you're doing 1 per year, I'm hard pressed to believe that 9 or 10 months later, if you have an incident and that may be the first time that the incident response plan is being activated since the tabletop exercise, I'm hard pressed to say that your team is ready and raring to go. That does not, to me, sound like a sufficient practice cadence to make sure that when something happens at 10 p.m. on a Friday night, people are going to know exactly what they need to do, and they're going to know exactly where to find the resources they need at the time. Once a quarter, though, that keeps everything top of mind. That makes sure that people are looking at this regularly, that you're getting your response team a chance to practice together, and it gives you the opportunity to practice a variety of circumstances and situations against all of the types of risks and incident types that your business is likely to be encountering. But in that, we recommend alternating each quarter. So 1 quarter, like Q1, do an executive paper only TTE. What we mean by that is we're not going hands-on with technology at the time. We're just looking at PowerPoint slides and maybe some additional paper like documentation artifacts. But that gives everybody a chance to walk through the technical discovery of an event, how the business is going to manage it, what the risks are, and how do we go about bringing in third parties and outside resources like insurance and law enforcement, et cetera. And then in Q2, we recommend doing a technical tabletop exercise. This is going to be more focused on the IT team and the information security team, where we design a scenario where the folks who are going to be likely to be hands-on with tools and technology get a chance to practice with those tools and technology. Your network team needs to know, how do we find a device that's floating around on the network just from an IP address or a MAC address? How do we sift through firewall logs to find traffic of some suspicious activity? How do we track down a rogue wireless device, for example? These are all things which are great to talk about during a tabletop exercise, but they're going to need to take those actions and translate them into technical commands. And they're going to need to know the dashboards that they're using and the systems that they're using to actually perform those actions. So every other quarter, like Q2 and Q4, for example, we recommend doing a technical tabletop exercise, which is focused on the IT teams, the security teams, and all the work that they're going to need to be thinking about and working on during an actual incident. And then for the other alternate quarter, so again, Q3 here, we go back to an executive or a paper only TTE, which is more of a whole of business type of approach. So that gives your executive team 2 opportunities over the course of the year to practice full on whole of business incident response activities. They understand more about here's what the business is going to need, here's what the IT teams and the technical teams are going to need, but you also find gaps in the IR plans and processes. You find out, hey, people don't know that these are the policies and plans. They don't know where the IR plan is. We've done tabletop exercises where half of the response team members are finding out at the tabletop exercise that they're on the response team. Prior to that meeting invite, they were blissfully unaware that they were likely to be called at 2 a.m. when somebody's saying, hey, the New York Times is looking for comment here. And so making sure that everybody has a chance to learn these things ahead of time, but also to practice them, ideally more than once per year, is the best and only way to make sure that they stay sharp and current. The one exception to that, I would say, is if your organization is contending with multiple security incidents every year. And again, to Mike's point, this is not, oh, somebody clicked an email, or yeah, this computer got a virus, but don't worry, we took care of it. I'm talking full security activations. You want to make sure that if your organization is activating your IR plan, rallying your IR team quite regularly, that's practice. Even if it is during a live event, I'd say, yeah, you're getting a chance to exercise that, as long as you're making forward momentum with it, as long as you're continuing the cycle of continuous improvement, where you take lessons learned coming out of those incidents and events and you use them to apply the program. If you're not, if you're just activating your IR team maybe once a year, once every couple of years, and you do these tabletops every once in a while, that's not enough practice for me. I see organizations which struggle in those circumstances here.
And
Nick, I'd like to.
Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah,
Fred.
yeah, I do want to point out too. A lot of people will say, "Well, there's no way we can get this large of a team together all together that frequently." And I will tell you, in a real world scenario, you will be missing members of your IR team because people are sick, on vacation, and otherwise. So you need to practice what it's like when key members of your team cannot join that particular incident response because they're out. That's part of it, learning how to deal with missing members.
And
I got to give Tad props for the joke of the year there.
Okay. But also in the chat is a good question for us to dive into, and it's from Greg. We're about to conduct our first tabletop. The first thought is that the first tabletop will include only IT, just to run through our IR plan for the first time and fine tune it from an IT perspective before conducting a larger one that includes other players. Is this a wise approach, Fred?
I'm sorry, I missed that question.
I'll take it.
It broke up. It broke up.
Mike,
on me when
Mike, go ahead, and then
So
JLP.
I'm going to agree with April, right? Because you want to make sure that when you bring the executives to the table, you're not fumbling around on the IT side, that you got the IT side pretty well handled. And what you're bringing to the table are the decision makers, the people who are going to communicate, the people who may have to finance things, all of that stuff. And they shouldn't be critiquing bad IT response.
Yeah, John Luke, do you agree?
I do. Yeah, I do see a counterpoint, because we've done so many tabletop exercises where the entire response team is coming to the table for the first time. They understand that the business as a whole is doing this for the first time. And so everybody's kind of discovering and exploring it together. If you can have that dialogue with your executive team and you have trust and confidence that they're going to be in that kind of exploratory, let's figure this out as we go along together type of mode, I think that's great. But yeah, to April's point, I absolutely agree. IT needs to be coordinated and know what your current capabilities are before you bring in senior executives to join your tabletop exercise, if they're expecting a nice polished response activity there.
Yeah, I might have a bit of a contrarian response as the person who did not come with an IT background here. So I was once in an organization where the IT team did a tabletop. So they did an earthquake, not cyber, but they did an earthquake recovery thing, and they didn't include other departments. It was just the IT team. And we only found out after they did it, and it was like, wait, what? I would say if you're going to do that, then you probably want to have one scheduled in the future that will include other people, so that they know, hey, we're doing this, and we have one in the future that's inclusive. My opinion. Everybody has a little bit different opinion on that. All right. Uh,
Before we move on from that, I'm going to quote Macklemore here just because I was listening to him over the weekend and I agree here. The greats weren't great because at birth they could paint. The greats were great because they paint a lot. IR plans and tabletops and IR activations, I think, are exactly the same. It's not going to be a skill which comes naturally and easily just because you're in IT. It's going to be something which you have to practice over and over and over again to get good at. And the organizations which do that are organizations which can handle incidents without them being full-on disasters each and every time.
and
Yeah.
only when your IR company is in Seattle does it come with quotes from Macklemore. Mike, go ahead.
Just going to say the music analogies work really well here. If you want to be good, you got to practice.
Yeah. And hey, Bobby Jean asked a question. What are your thoughts on use of e-learning tools to run the declaration process and initial communication and activation steps? What do you think, John?
I'm curious to know what she means by that. Tell me a little bit more about e-learning tools and how they would be used in that kind of way. I'm very intrigued. Hopefully we can watch for more info here, but as it stands, I've got more questions and answers on that one.
One interesting piece to this is a lot of people where they struggle is what is an incident and when do we declare that? And I do want to point out that shouldn't be part of your IR plan. That should be part of an incident management policy, right? Which is where you define what it is that kicks off the plan. So keep in mind there's a lot of moving parts here that you need to manage.
Yeah, and Eddie's question, Mike, when you have a mix of remote and on-site staff, should the TTE be in person or hybrid, and does it matter?
I don't think it really matters. I mean, it's always good to have inflection, tone of voice, body language, things like that. That always helps. But in today's world, it is what it is, right? I mean, so this is a tabletop exercise. It's not, if it was going to be something like a functional exercise, right? Like a disaster recovery, a business continuity exercise that's functional, where you're actually going to kick out the wire in, a server that you expect to fail over. I think you want everybody there on prem. When you're doing a tabletop, I don't think it matters that much.
I mean,
Yeah,
I think
I'll add in there that we've been doing virtual tabletops since 2020, since COVID started. And in a lot of instances, I'd say that the virtual exercises went a lot better than they would have in person. We've also seen some organizations where they'll have either some or everybody in a conference room and we're hosting things virtually. That also works very well. What seems to be the sweet spot is a balance of both, where you've got a conference room in the office and folks who are there come and rally in person. And then we also have folks who have joined up by Teams or Zoom. That seems to be most likely the way that incidents will actually go. Again, Friday night, 10 p.m. incidents, you're not likely to have everybody in a conference room there. So you want to be comfortable being on Teams meetings and Zoom meetings and working remotely like that. Tabletops are a great practice opportunity for that.
Yeah, and so Bobby expanded on the e-learning question. We have simulation tools where we can present scenarios and ask them to respond. Then there's an education piece to the recommended steps to respond, such as how do I activate SnapCom online or our alternate offline communication tool.
I think that in order to cover the breadth of activities that would have to happen in all the different scenarios, I think it's better to work from playbooks rather than trying to program that system to understand every nuance. I think it could be useful. I think it would take a whole lot of configuration to actually describe an incident and all of the options there.
So I'm going to disagree because our scenario guides are very methodically laid out. As a matter of fact, they're all built into
This is
tables
true.
that talk about each. They're called injections. Every time you add a new piece of information, hey, we just got a report that the email server's down, right? Hey, we just got a report that this system is beaconing out to command and control. Each injection should have then a set of things that you expect to happen, the people that should be involved, the next actions that should lead to. So I can see how you could build something like this that rolls out differing pieces of information, different injections, as a useful way of doing this. So I think it's an interesting concept.
And Marshall asks, how detailed should a tabletop be for IT staff? I think engineers in general struggle with ambiguity, which isn't always conducive with an incident. Do you think a more detailed approach is better than kind of moving through an incident with more ambiguity?
I think that well-designed playbooks provide the detail that's necessary there. And so that's another thing that we haven't really talked about is, the actual account takeover, account compromise, right? What are the steps you go through? Shut down all active sessions, force password changes, right? Stuff like that. Those are pretty detailed. And the exercise itself really is to let everyone know what their role is here. And again, an incident management team should designate the response team, which will work from a detailed playbook, ideally. Right? I mean, there's all kinds of flavorings of this, but I mean, this is how we do it, and this is how we like to do it.
I would say, ironically, the place where IT and information security are going to be most active is probably in the ambiguity stage, where we don't really know what's happening, and they're trying to figure that out. That's the unfortunate role they have to play. They have to figure out things based on a set of symptoms and realities, and figure out what's going on. As Mike alluded to, once we've identified what it is, then the playbook comes out, and it's literally step by step by step. A ransomware playbook will literally go and say, log into Veeam, press this button in Veeam. It'll literally tell you the steps and the buttons to press to recover for whatever scenario you're trying to recover from.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to move us forward to cybersecurity insurance. Recognizing that we could spend an entire hour on cybersecurity insurance, there are some really important things. There are a lot of orgs that don't have cybersecurity insurance and have never investigated it. You should.
And can't get it.
And then that's what I was saying. And then there are some that can't get it. If you can't get it, that's a different story. And we may have some ways to help you. Let us know. But many that do have it don't necessarily understand the requirements. Like, when do you notify your insurance? What will your insurance company provide in case of an incident? Do they provide legal counsel or breach counselors, or none of the above? And if they do, what do they cover? One of the things that has definitely happened in the last 3 years, coverage amounts are lower, deductibles are higher. I just talked to an organization where their cybersecurity coverage went to half of what it was. They had a $5 million policy, went to $2.5 million, but the cost of it went up 420%. And the deductibles are usually very high. $50,000 is a deductible I've seen more and more and more. Sometimes, getting an incident response team outside of the insurance company is less than a deductible.
Sometimes you just can't do that.
And sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes
right, because the policy says you will use their responders.
Right. And sometimes that's right. Sometimes the insurance company says you have to use somebody from our list. One thing to keep in mind when you do that is, if you have somebody on their list, depending on which insurance company and which responder you have, that responder may be beholden to the insurance company and may be reporting findings to the insurance company before they report them to you. So one thing just to keep in mind. We have spent an enormous amount of time talking to insurance companies and insurance brokers about how they do it. But reasons to have it, it pays for recovery costs, pays for third-party services, downtime costs. I know there was one hospital that had an enormous amount of downtime and ended up, getting that back from their insurance company. Incident costs can quickly escalate, especially if there are problems in the response and it's a high impact attack. And then there are liabilities and damages, class action lawsuits. Hello, T-Mobile. As it said in the chat, but those things come up, and it's nice to have an insurance company on your side. So if you haven't already, investigate getting an insurance policy. Know your policy coverage amounts and deductibles. Know when you have to notify your carrier of an incident. There is one case that I saw last year where the original policy said that they had a week to notify their insurance company, but it also said that they could change that period by sending a letter. Well, at some point they sent a letter and said that the breach notification time was 48 hours. They notified them after 48 hours, and the insurance carrier said, sorry, we're not going to cover it.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Make a point here.
Yeah.
So everybody likes to beat up on insurance companies about this cyber insurance stuff, right? Because they never priced it right. They didn't understand the risk. They never had enough data to understand the risk. Let me just briefly say why this is a good thing that insurance companies are requiring all of these controls before they will give you insurance. It's because the trend right now is a lot of compromises happen through third parties. And if you have business associates, vendors, whoever, service providers that are not regulated, now the insurance company is regulating them. So that third party that you do business with, that is a threat to you, is now being held to account by an insurance company to make sure there are controls in place that probably weren't there before. So ultimately, this is a good thing. Ultimately, though, they're going to need to get better data, and they are going to have to learn how to price this correctly, or it's just not going to. This is not going to work. The two options to that are I've seen that insurance companies are starting to think about acquiring managed detection and response companies so
Mhm.
that they can, with their insurance, provide that monitoring. Then they have real time visibility into what kind of risk you are. The other part of that is the federal government getting closer and closer to being a reinsurer. So if there's one of these global events, the insurance companies don't get all beat up. So the addition of more data plus the backstop by the federal government helps to smooth all this out because right now it is a mess.
Yep. Yep, sure is. Fred, we wanted to talk about monitoring and alerting. And then Mark, I see your question, and we'll get back to it. Go ahead, Fred.
Sure. Well, there's the obvious, right? That if you don't have monitoring of all of your environments, then you're basically driving down the freeway with a blindfold on. People now are monitoring half of their environments. Hey, we're looking at endpoints, but we're not looking at the network. We're not looking at the cloud. You need to monitor everything, or you have no visibility to detect particular malicious activities, and certainly no ability to go backwards in an incident to determine what happened. And if you can't determine what is going on and what is happening, you have to assume the worst, both from an IT standpoint, I need to burn it down and rebuild everything, and from a regulatory standpoint, I need to tell the regulators and I need to tell them we can't really tell who got compromised. So that means we have to assume everybody was compromised, and we need to pay for everybody as if they've been had their data exposed. But there's another part to this, and that is how are you including your managed detection and response or your own monitoring into your IR plan? I can't tell you the number of times we get in a tabletop and someone says, hey, we've got a managed detection and response provider. I don't even have their number. I don't know who to call. Who do we even call over there during an incident? So you gotta have to make sure that if you have your own SOC, that you have fully integrated how they're going to operate throughout the IR process. Remember, it's not just in the beginning. They're going to be providing all the supplemental data that's going to tell you how bad things are and what you need to do to recover. So you need to manage internal team, you need to manage your external vendors. And some people say, well, I have my own internal SOC, but I'm also using Proofpoint for my email. Well, if I'm using an external vendor like that, most of us are for email, right? Maybe it's O365. You need to include those sources of data and how you're going to incorporate that monitoring alerting system with your own systems, your own on-premise systems. So you really need to practice with them, right? If you have somebody you're outsourcing this with, practice with them on how you're going to get the data you need during an incident and get it rapidly.
Yeah, for sure. And John Luke, do you want to talk about incident response retainers?
I will. This is an area where I have to give credit to Fred. This was Fred's program, which he built up here about a year ago. So as I'm talking here, I'm definitely standing on the shoulders of awesomeness. Incident response retainers, I believe, are the way of the future for businesses to be managing incident response and essentially making sure that you've got necessary coverage here. During an incident, if you need to pick up the phone and call an IR service provider cold, you're going to need to be essentially starting from scratch as a customer. You're going to be getting an SOW or a proposal, a scope of work, or some kind of cost estimate here. Those estimates then need to get circulated internally to make sure that your executive team, your CFO are going to sign off and approve it. Then you need to actually get the contract signed. Sometimes that involves a legal review from the client side where, any terms and conditions they're about to agree to have to get reviewed and signed off by their attorney before they can move forward here. There are times when this can be additional days before the incident response team is able to get started. There are other times where we're able to get all that paperwork knocked out inside of an hour or two because the client understands this is urgent. We need to move forward very quickly here. But there's a lot of organizations which have very strict processes for vendor acquisition or signing and executing a statement of work. And those have to be followed even during incidents and emergencies. So an IR retainer helps skip all of that process by making sure that it's done long in advance of an incident. With an IR retainer, you're essentially pre-funding an incident response contract. You get a block of hours that are sitting there on standby for you to pick up the phone and activate. In CI's case, we're typically on the phone working with a client within 2 hours of first finding out they've got an incident and they need help. And a lot of times that's just putting an extra pair of eyes on identifying, do you have an incident? Is this something that you need to activate IR services for? Or is it, just a rogue email or an antivirus alert which came in, but it's kind of no big deal. At the very least, you've got that ability. You've got the outside resources so you can call and say, is this a fire? Do I actually need to pull the fire alarm here? And then if you do, you know that you've got a team on standby who can jump into action with you right away. We don't need to worry about, here's the amount, here's how much we're talking about. Do you have approval for this? Can we get the contract signed? Oops, it got DocuSigned to the wrong email address. Nope, forward it over to the right person. Let's get this taken care of here. Again, hours count, especially when we're talking about a compromised user account, a compromised admin account, ransomware, which may be working its way across your servers. Time is absolutely critical in those first stages of an emergency.
And
So,
and
yeah, go ahead.
and I'll say, in those first stages when you're calling your insurance company, one of the things that John Luke and I have spent the last year and a half working on is working with a bunch of insurance companies. So we are now listed as able to respond on their panel, which sort of answers the question from before.
Yep,
Sorry, go ahead, John
exactly.
Luke.
So the other thing that I like about our IR retainer program, and again, credit to Fred here for his application of this, there's a lot of organizations which charge a contract fee and/or the funds become use it or lose it. You spend $30,000 on an IR retainer, 5,000 of that is just getting the contract in place, and then if you don't use them by the end of a year or within 2 years or something, those funds are gone. Our IR program is not structured that way. We, one, don't have any contract or maintenance and management fees. So if you spend $20,000 on an IR retainer, you get $20,000 worth of hours available. The other side to that is if you don't use hours in that first year, they convert over to professional services hours. Now, they don't roll over into a new IR retainer contract, but what that means is that if you invest $20,000 or $50,000 in an IR retainer and you only use half of it, or 10,000 or 5,000 is left at the end of the year, for example, that amount converts over into general professional services hours that you can use for a tabletop exercise or a pen test or a security assessment, or it can be applied towards a larger SOW or a larger project. And so we want to make sure that A, you get your money and your value's worth, and B, that you've got a team on hand who you can pick up and call at 2 a.m. to say, I think I'm staring at an incident. I'm not sure yet. Can you help me out here? So I'm a big fan of IR retainers. We're seeing this much more commonly throughout the course of the work that we do, both in terms of actual incident response, as well as just general security assessments and compliance review here. Fred, anything you want to share about your program here?
Yeah. So the one thing I always like to tell people, a lot of people say, well, I've got cyber insurance. They're going to provide a breach coach and investigators. And I say, well, you probably still, unless you have a really advanced team yourself that can absolutely verify that an incident is real, then you probably still need somebody on retainer to help you get through those initial stages, hopefully stop the bleeding, because it'll be, you have to first prove that something has gone wrong and you've been breached to an insurance company before they're going to send somebody out. Well, we may be able to get in there and stop it before you need to call the insurance company, right? So having us on retainer is nothing about having insurance precludes the need to have somebody like us or your own team to be able to do all that initial investigation, prove that it's an incident, submit that package to the insurers. So then you have a high probability that they're going to pay on the claim.
Yeah. And, as we're going to go to some final thoughts here in a second. Before we do, I do want to say, we have a survey that we do in each one of these, and my colleague Jenny is going to put it in the chat here. So we'll put it in the chat now before you leave today. It'd be awesome if folks filled out the survey, and I'll explain why in a second. But, as you think about anything, 3 things to get right: preparing for an incident, detecting it quickly, and responding rapidly. All things we talked about, Q&A we've been doing throughout. Our surveys this year, we make a donation to the Society for Information Management for each one you do. It came up from one of our longtime clients, and they said, "Hey, this is a great organization." So when you fill out a survey, that's what you do. Also, people filling out the survey have made us better at what we do. I do want to get to some final thoughts here, but I also recognize that we had a question in the chat that we didn't get to, which is from Mark, which is, what do incident response plans need to look like to get insurance? Do insurance companies need to see satisfactory SOC 2 reports, for example?
So I have never seen and surprisingly, never seen an insurance company ask for a SOC 2 report, at least with the customer base that we work with, right? Because we work with a whole lot of mid-market. And so SOC 2 isn't generally something everybody has lying around. And what I have seen is they mainly, and this is another problem where insurance companies are not pricing risk correctly because they don't have good data. They go on attestation. Tell me if you have these controls in place. And then later, if they come in with the smoke jumpers and they find out that you attested to controls that are not there, they can deny coverage. So, as all this continues to evolve, they're going to want, potentially audited controls. They could even hire a firm to come in and check you out and give you a risk rating, and that's how your insurance is going to be priced. Or, like I said, it's going to be bundled with continuous monitoring.
Yeah.
Just because they don't have good data, they can't price it, and if they lose money, it goes away.
That's right. That's right. And I put this slide up as we go to final thoughts. We have a colleague, Ellie, who can set up a chat with John Luke or with Fred or with Mike, or with me if you want to talk about media questions, which I realize I now committed to sending to everybody. I'll send you questions the media might ask you in case of a breach, as a follow-up to all of this. But let's do some final thoughts here. John Luke?
IR plans, absolutely a great place to start. Know when you reach your limits, know when to call out for help, either to get a review of the IR plan or to help put one together. And then tabletop exercises. It's so critical to make sure that you practice the IR plan. But even if you don't have one, do tabletops anyway. Give your team an opportunity to practice coming together. Even if you're fumbling through it in a group, that's great. You're going to be better coming out the other end of it. And then get response retainers. Again, I think it's absolutely the trend of the industry that we're seeing, not just cybersecurity and service providers like us, but clients all over the place are reporting, hey, I just got this retainer. I got signed up with these folks and everything. It's a card you want to have in your back pocket, and you absolutely want to be in a position of having it and not needing it rather than needing it and not having it.
Fred, final thoughts?
Yeah. So Taylor Swift, their band is getting ready to go on a world tour. You can bet that they are practicing every day, all day before that tour. If they make a mistake on stage, it costs them probably nothing. If you make a mistake during an incident response, it can cost you millions or even your entire business. Practice, folks. Just that, it's simple. You just need to practice.
Mike, final thoughts?
It's 21st century, folks. There are activists, mercenaries, bribed insiders. Nation states are stealing money now. This is really important stuff. So when Jake puts up the 3 rings that say prepare, detect, respond, prepare doesn't mean go buy firewalls and endpoint stuff. Prepare means get ready to take a punch and get up off the mat. That's what this whole chat was about, right? This isn't about, preventive controls and things like this. You were going to assume I'm going to take it on the chin and we're going to come through this thing, right? That's what that prepare means.
Yep. And he said put up the rings, so I did. Okay, everybody, we really appreciate you being here. Remember, incident response is incident response prep is really important. Doing that tabletop exercise, making sure you're monitoring your network, making sure you know who you're going to call when an incident happens, your insurance company, us, whoever, make sure you have that planned. If you want to contact us, shoot me a note, jake@criticalinsight.com, or my colleague Ellie, who can set up a meeting with the other folks here. That's Ellie@criticalinsight.com. And please take the survey. And we really appreciate you being here. And for those of you who we haven't seen this year, Happy New Year.
Yep.
Thank you very much. All right, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye
Bye,
bye.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody.